12:30. And currently it looks like we have about 20 participants on the call, and it looks like it is climbing right now. So we just want to welcome all of you to our second Equity Talks discussion. We hosted our first discussion last month with Willie Burrows from the San Antonio School District, and we heard a lot of positive feedback and encouragement to keep these conversations going. And so we're very excited to be talking with you today. So you may be asking yourself, what is Equity Talks and why are they important? And so we know that there's a lot of things that are happening currently in our country. And so it was really important that we created a venue for people to be able to engage in conversations and wanted to create a safe space to do so. And so we've had support from our senior leadership team, and said it was really important that we want people to be able to engage in conversations, feel that it's a safe place to do that, and provide a platform for all of us to hear different perspectives, to learn and grow. So the Education Subcommittee, which is part of the larger D&I group, put together these 1-hour discussions. And really, again, it's to provide a space for all of us to engage in these important conversations. There are a couple guiding principles that are really important to ensure that this works well. And so knowing that there's going to be a diversity of perspectives and viewpoints that are going to be brought into these conversations, it's really important that we engage and sit with discomfort, because there are going to be some viewpoints that may be different than our own. And so it's important to be curious about it, to ask questions, so that way we can continue to learn and grow. And so we're hoping that you will engage and join in the conversation today. And so we're very excited to have Danielle with us, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about her in a moment, but we're on a different platform today. So we wanted to use Zoom. And the reason for that is we wanted to provide a way to invite you all into the conversation and feel like we're in a room. So we've created this virtual room in Zoom. And so as you know, with technology, and when you try something new, sometimes things may be a little hiccupy. So we ask that you send positive vibes to Zoom, so that way it behaves for us over the next hour. But then also, if by chance we have some technical difficulties, that you bear with us as we work through those. But with Zoom, you have the ability to share your camera, and so we encourage you to do that. You also have the ability to unmute yourself. And so if there's a time where you have a question, you can unmute yourself and join in the conversation, and we invite you to do that. You also can submit your questions via the chat, and I'll be monitoring the chat during this discussion, and I can bring those conversations into the room as well. So we want you to join in. We want to see your cameras. We want to hear your voice. And so you do have the ability to do that. So Shanice and I, we were talking, and of course we got great feedback from the last session, and we're like, oh my gosh, the bar is high. How do we continue to keep this bar high and ensure that we're bringing in great speakers in the organization? And so she was familiar with Danielle Sydnor from her network. And so she had reached out to Danielle, had a conversation with her. And so we're incredibly excited to have Danielle with us today. So let me tell you a little bit about Danielle, and then I'm going to toss it over to Shanice and Danielle to talk us through this conversation. So Danielle Sydnor is the founder and CEO of We Win Strategies Group, and it's a firm dedicated to working with a diverse array of stakeholders to create win-win outcomes for individuals, organizations, and communities. Danielle was most recently the executive director of Economic and Community Development Institute, Northern Ohio, a statewide CDFI, where she led a multi-city team and oversaw operations, fundraising, and stakeholder engagement. Danielle worked in banking since 2002, including National City Bank, MBNA, and Bank of America, with experience in retail banking, management, and credit card sales, services, and lending. Danielle became licensed as a financial advisor with Merrill Lynch in 2011, and she continues to draw from her professional experiences to build genuine relationships where clients, partners, and communities can benefit. Danielle is the president for the Greater Cleveland chapter of the National Associate for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, And as president, Sydnor is responsible for fighting for the equality of rights of all persons with a focus on eliminating racial hatred and racial discrimination. Danielle is the president of the Board of Trustees at Eliza Bryant Village and the second VP of the National NAACP Next Gen Alumni Council, just to name a few of her accomplishments. She holds a bachelor's degree in finance from the University of Phoenix. She is a proud recipient of Crain's Cleveland 2019 40 Under 40 and a current member of the 2020 class of Leadership Ohio. Danielle is a native of Sacramento, California. Her family moved to Cleveland in 1995, and she is since proudly deep in her roots and lives in Shaker Heights with her two sons, Noah and Giles. And I just got to give a shout out. Her profile picture is just absolutely beautiful. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Shanice and Danielle to walk us through our conversation for today. Thank you so much for joining us, Danielle.
Thank you. I make sure I unmute myself. You get on Zoom and you start talking and nobody can hear you. So thank you for going through that bio. I always really want to condense it down, but people ask you more stuff. So sometimes it's easy just to put it in the bio. But I am proud mostly of my two sons, Noah and Giles, who are 17 and soon to be 16. And fortunately, they're away at football practice right now. Otherwise, they stand over me as I'm on Zoom and try and ask me questions. I'm like, guys, I'm the one talking on Zoom, so I can't look away at you and have a conversation. Just text me, act like I'm not here. It's been fun parenting and navigating work from home, which I'm sure many of you all are doing the same thing. But I just want to say thank you again to Shanice and Tanya, who have spent some time with me prior to jumping on today to make sure that we do have a very thoughtful, productive, not only presentation, but conversation. And I'll tell you that I actually prefer being able to just engage with people and answer questions, because there's some value in kind of being a talking head and telling people what you think and your experiences. But I find the most value in really being able to be vulnerable and available to answer the questions that people have kind of burning and percolating. So I do have a couple of slides that we'll go through, and I have some just kind of general points that I want to make available of my thoughts about where we are in this moment and how we all have an opportunity to kind of show up in the spaces where we exist, whether that's home or work or community. But then I really do want to hopefully create an experience that allows us to have some discussion, because there are things that maybe I haven't thought about that are burning for you that we can use this time together to evaluate and address. So as the bio kind of talked about, I am the new CEO of We Win Strategies Group, a firm that I actually launched in May of this year. So crazy enough to do something new during a pandemic, but it really was the culmination of, I think, a lot of experiences and where we find ourselves navigating COVID-19 and this space of inclusion and thinking about the impacts of a pandemic and the need for inclusive recovery efforts to ensure that individuals and communities that were already under-resourced or marginalized didn't have the burden of trying to figure out how they might recover and get access to resources that are coming from federal, state, and local programs. So that was really the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, that pushed me over the edge and said, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it now. And partly because my parents were entrepreneurs and risk takers. And so I grew up in a household of people that encouraged the belief that if there is something that you want to accomplish, go for it, try. The worst thing you do is fail, but you learn something in the process. And so I wanted to start off our discussion today with some words of inspiration. And I really think it's important to kind of set the tone for how I really view and think about activism. And so Shirley Chisholm was the first African-American female to be elected to Congress and hailed out of New York. But then one of her other very notable accomplishments was that she was the first Black woman to be to run on a platform for one of the major political offices, for the office of president. And so if you've ever had an opportunity to watch any of her documentaries, there's one that come out recently where she talks about the fact that she didn't believe that the country was ready to elect her, but that by her being willing to boldly go and campaign, that it was going to set the foundation for some future, candidate to potentially ascend to the office of presidency. So you don't make progress by standing on the sidelines, whimpering and complaining. You make progress by implementing ideas. And I think that's so important because in this moment, everybody's grappling for what role do I play? What should I be doing? Whose responsibility is this? I maybe didn't personally create racism or discrimination. You know, maybe there are people who created these institutions that are no longer here, but what role do we all play in continuing to uphold them? And what role do we play in dismantling them? And so I want to talk a little bit briefly about the roles that I play in both of the capacities that I really sit in. And I always tell people that as president of the NAACP, I am a volunteer. I don't get paid for the work of the NAACP. It is really like a full-time job, but it is coming from a place of passion. And that's always something that kind of shocks people because it's a lot of responsibility. There's a lot of burden attached to it. But ultimately, when people understand that it's not a paid role, they look differently. Like, are you crazy? Why would you go do that stuff for free? Right? Who really? I mean, it's grueling work. I'm not always everyone's friend. Everybody doesn't necessarily want to see me coming. There are places and institutions that are sometimes fearful of the NAACP. But really, what I am attempting to do in that role is create a space where the Black community and communities of color more broadly have better access. One of my fundamental beliefs about some of the struggles that we have in society is we absolutely have a race issue, but we also have a class issue in America. And a portion of how and why we see situations exacerbated is along many times class lines. And so we'll get into that a little bit more as we talk, but really I try and use the platform of the NAACP to help create access for people. My role with We Win Strategies is really, again, a similar type of effort in that within the small business and economic development arena, oftentimes individuals who come from under-resourced and marginalized communities, other people are planning for them. Other people are coming up with ideas and solutions of what their neighborhoods, what their communities need, what their businesses need. And so being a person myself who grew up in a household where we lived in Section 8 housing, my parents started a printing company in our garage and then ultimately moved that business to a storefront and then a larger building and a larger building, and then packed all that up and moved from all the way from California to Ohio, which, you know, I've been here since 1995, but I'm a California girl at heart. I need sun. And so any day I can get some sunshine is a great day. But having those experiences and then also being a financial advisor where I dealt with high net worth individuals, you know, you had to have at least $250,000 of liquid assets to be my client. I've been in all types of rooms with all kinds of people. And so I really felt like I had a responsibility to use this really unique network that I have of the folks that people really are trying to solve problems for, because I'm one of those people, but I also have the privilege of having access to senators and CEOs and decision makers. And so I view it as a responsibility and a privilege to have such an expansive network that I can bring ideas and solutions, not for those other people, but for myself, because I have that shared lived experience. And so really the work that kind of keeps me, or how I keep myself motivated through this work, is really the photo that you see on the screen. So those two guys I talked about, Noah and Giles, my whole life, it has been really walking alongside of my parents and their experiences, and not necessarily totally understanding exactly how they struggled or how they were able to navigate creating the experiences and the opportunities that they provided. I'm the fourth of six kids, which you'll see in the next slide, but I had a very unique upbringing in that I saw the poverty and I saw the struggle, but then I also saw access, and I saw what programs and resources could do to create individual, upward, and community mobility. So I use the shield of the NAACP as something that's a part of my why, because I do believe that we sometimes feel like organizations that were founded more than 100 years ago are old and they're dated and they don't have any relevance or significance. But I think what we're seeing is in this moment, these institutions and organizations are foundational. They created the space for the movement for Black lives. They created the space for the movement of Black Lives Matter. They've created the space for the LGBTQ movement. They created this space for many of the other things that we see as now acceptable and as things that we're more comfortable talking about. It is because of the power of these old brands and institutions that we now can be innovative and think new ways and have conversations like this together. You know, I also elevate the role at Eliza Bryant Village because it was very unique in the way that I ended up being on the board. I went through the Cleveland Leadership Center's Bridge Builders program, and one of my mentors in that program said, "Hey, are you looking for any additional leadership opportunities?" And you know, I seem to have a knack for saying yes, so I said, "Sure, why not?" And he said, "Well, I know this guy who's the nominating chair of this board, and they're looking for young people," right? You know, you always get that. I don't know how long I still get to kind of fit into that young person category, but I'm under 40, so maybe that gives me a few more years. But when he asked me and he tells me what the organization is, I'm like, a senior citizens like nursing home. I was 30-ish something at the time, barely 30. Didn't really understand how I could provide value or be relevant in that kind of space. But you know, when your mentor asks you to do something, the first thing you should do is probably say yes and then figure out how to weasel out of it if you don't really want to do it. So I say yes, and I go to this lunch meeting with the nominating chair. And after talking to him, it really left an impression on me about how differently we think and treat people in capitalism when they're no longer producers. Seniors are people in our communities that we often feel they don't add any more value. And it's a very, I think in COVID-19, we've heard that even more as doctors have to choose. If I'm gonna put somebody on the ventilator, I have to understand, is there some sort of potential that they survive this? What's their quality of life after? If I'm looking at where I allocate tax dollars for programs or housing or new developments, and I know I look at the body of work that you all do in NRP group, that people have to grapple with these choices and decisions. And seniors, especially marginalized seniors, and so Eliza Bryant, 99.99% of our clients are dually eligible for Medicare and Medicaid. So these are individuals who come from very, very meager means. And many times, well, the majority of our residents are African American. So it's the oldest continuously operating African American founded nursing home in the United States. And so you have this population that, again, you start to add the levels of marginalization on and how that's compounded over their lifetime. They just want to be able to still retire and live in dignity as a senior, even if they have, you know, very meager means. And so that really always keeps me centered, because I believe that it's important to take care of our elders. I believe that it's important that we advocate for those that struggle with having access and a voice. And then the other two logos that you see on there, Suds Brewing Company and the caricature of my sons, I really felt it was important to pass on the spirit of innovation and entrepreneurship to my sons, because it is what has caused me to feel more confident as a leader. I've always felt like, regardless of who I'm in the room with, my mom would always tell me, they use the bathroom just like you do. And that's like, that really humbles you when you know at the end of the day, all of the fancy titles, whatever, they still have to go to the bathroom too. And I'm like, yeah, that's a great way. So when you're sitting in front of your boss and you're intimidated, you're like, they're gonna have to have a bathroom break sometime today too. It helps to humanize people, right? And so my sons have been, it's important to me that they have those experiences of not being intimidated by authority or power, not being intimidated by leadership, but being able to see themselves in the same vein and see themselves as leaders and owners and bosses, regardless of what they decided to do. So a few years ago, they started a soap company. They use beer to make soap. If you've never tried their soap, you know, this is not a paid advertisement, but you should check it out, Suds Brewing Company. They were 12 and 13 when we started the business. And I made them go to pitch competitions, and they went through an accelerator program, and they had to do the homework. So they've done market analysis, they do customer analysis, and they had to learn words that they'd never used before: revenue, gross margin, net profit, all of those things. And really, I would have this conversation with them that when you first started playing NBA 2K or Madden, you didn't know how to play it, but you learned, you figured it out, Minecraft or whatever other video games they're doing right now. And so I take that same approach to them having experiences outside of maybe what's delivered and brought at school. So we can go to the next slide. The other part of, you know, the experiences for my sons is making sure that they also show up with me in spaces of advocacy as well. Because one of the reasons that I fight as hard as I do is I have an obligation to make the generation coming behind me have more access than even what I was born into. And so the other part of how I think we show up in these different roles is by making sure we're creating the example for the next generation. And so recently the NAACP has probably been called on more than ever to partner with organizations, to be present, to be relevant. And this past June, on Juneteenth, like many organizations who are grappling with how do we create space for the community, even in a pandemic, to express their frustration, to express their gratitude, to express their feelings about all that was happening in society. And there were so many narratives about all of the civil unrest and, you know, kind of connecting it to rioting and less than peaceful, you know, environments. And so we took that opportunity to say we were going to partner with some other organizations, and we held what we call the Freedom Walk. We didn't want to call it a march and a protest because, again, that sometimes invites in individuals who want to accost the message and make it something that you're not trying to accomplish. We were really very intentional about it beginning and maintaining peace the whole time because we wanted that message to be the focal point. The other a part of this experience was really just giving the community a space to elevate its voice. And I chose this particular picture because in that week, I had probably been to a couple of different march and protests, and it becomes taxing trying to do that all and wear a mask, and we're walking, and I don't exercise like I should. So we walked almost about half a mile, I think maybe a little bit more than that. And so at some point I was like, listen, you know, the bullhorn is cool, but I saw this little kid and he was a voice I could hear over myself in the bullhorn. So I turned around and I handed it to him, and he led us in chant for quite a few blocks. So we got to our final destination. His mom came up to me and said, can we take a picture with you? Absolutely. And she said, he told me this morning when we got up, I want to lead the march. And she's like, you have no idea how much you made his day when you gave him that bullhorn. I said, well, I could hear his voice over the crowd. So I just felt like, you know, he was already demonstrating his desire to participate. Why not give him the megaphone? But I use it as an example because in all that we're grappling with today, people are looking for the silver bullet, like that one specific thing that we're going to do to change things. But I think it's every one of these small individual moments that we're planting the right seeds, and we're creating an environment, and we're creating a community that really helps live up to the ideals of what America espouses to be. And so in these moments, I just want to impress upon all of us, whether you have children or not, the next generation is watching how we show up in this moment. They're watching our habits and behaviors. They're watching whether we wear masks or not. They're watching how we respond to people who do wear masks or don't wear masks. They're watching to understand how we're grappling when people say Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter. They're watching all of the things that we're saying and doing. And so that means we have a level of responsibility as well. And so I think the other thing that's important is I didn't get here by myself. And again, I talked about my parents a little bit, but really I've had all types of influences in my life that have created for me the desire and the interest in doing more. And so family is such a huge part of my life because I come from a very large family. Like I said, I'm the fourth of 6 kids. My father is the oldest of 14, and my grandmother was one of 18. So we're like a small village when we get together. And so I'm going to start in the top left corner and kind of work my way around in these photos. But the lady in the top left corner is my great aunt, Cecilia Huffman, who is someone who I really call a master negotiator. And actually, I'm going to skip over to the the top right corner is her sister, Alice Huffman. So these are my grandmother's sisters. But these were 2 women who, when I was younger, I had no idea what they did. But like they had a pool in their backyard. They drove like a Volvo and Mercedes, and they had American Express credit cards and fur coats. So I didn't really care what they did. I was like, whatever they do, I want to do that when I grow up, because They take me to fancy restaurants and meetings and all kinds of things. And as I became an adult, I learned more about their personal stories and backgrounds and how they got to where they did. And so Cecilia is the one who really taught me the value and importance of relationships. No matter who's in the room with her, you feel like you're the most important person at the moment, and there could be 100 people, and everybody feels like they have all of Cecilia's attention. And so when I decided to become a financial advisor, I spent a lot of time with her thinking about people that she knew that she'd be willing to introduce me to. And just from being around, she always is volunteering and serving. And I also learned from her servant leadership, because she doesn't ask people to do things that she's not willing to do herself. And right below the picture of Cecilia and I in the little bubble, that's my great grandmother, my great grandmother and great great grandmother. And I've heard the stories of, you know, their transitions and the struggles that they've had. And so even though I don't remember ever meeting my great grandmother, but I have photos with her, and I never met my great great grandmother, the experiences that they passed on to their children and their fight and their willingness to not take no for an answer was something that was really kind of impressed upon all of us. So my great aunt Alice Huffman, she's on the national board of the NAACP. She is on the national Democratic National Committee. She planned the 2004 convention with Site Selection Committee. So she's always been in some capacity adjacent to politics, never been a politician herself, but again, someone who knew everybody. And I saw her move, and I saw her make very decisive decisions as a Black female, and again, not take no for an answer, and to put herself in positions where she had to make the tough call. And she's had articles written about her that are not always the most favorable, but she puts her foot down, and she says she believes it, she stands by it. And that was something that really was an important principle for me to learn from a leadership perspective. I had an opportunity to attend the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington with the two of them, which is the photo at the bottom. And they would be upset for me to tell you this, but they are 80 and 84 years old and still on national boards and still traveling. And it's only because of COVID-19 that they have slowed down at all. And they've moved. I tried to call my aunt the other day, and she finally called me back and was like, "You kept interrupting me, and I was on my Zoom meeting." I'm like, "Oh, I'm so sorry," you know. But they're still active and very busy today. And then in the center, I did not put a picture of my father, who has passed away, because he's not living now and wasn't here for the photo. But I had an opportunity recently to take some pictures with my family, and it's hard to get this many people together in one place in time, but we happen to all be in the same city for once. And I look at my siblings, because those are my first built-in friends, my first built-in enemies, my first built-in competitors. And really what was instilled upon us from my parents is that we didn't have to be the same. We were allowed to be individuals. And really, again, I think in this moment, as we're talking about race relations, as we think about leadership, there's value in knowing that it's okay for us to be individuals. We don't have to be like the person next to us. But what I did learn from my parents is that I must respect the differences that my siblings have. I have some that are more sensitive. I have some that are more aggressive. And it was my responsibility to be able to figure out how to navigating those things, because we weren't forced to think or be the same. We've always been allowed to be individuals. And so what I would say to those that are saying in this moment, companies and organizations are really, they're donating to Black Lives Matter, or they're donating to the NAACP, they're donating other places, really as somewhat of a reaction to what has happened. And I think we have to pause and acknowledge that. And I can say that from a place of, there are organizations that I had tried to communicate with prior to a few months ago that would have been little to not interested at all in attaching themselves to the NAACP. And it's very interesting now that people want to be on the right side of history, right? They want to not be in a situation where they feel like everybody else put out a statement and everybody else made a donation, so let me figure out how to do it. And so as institutions, many of us are grappling with, do we accept those donations? Do we partner with those organizations? Because everybody that now is having the conversation, there's also some concern of, in 12 months from now, will they still care? Or will there be a new headline that they've moved on to that, you know, we're looking at as more important. And so,
and Danielle, I was gonna say I wanted to ask you about some of that, and I also wanted to thank you too, because I think it's so special. This is like our second equity talk, that you can come in and not just show us your bio or, you know, have your bio read, but also kind of include all the other influences and things that have made you the leader you are. But when you said that, it just, the one thing that it brought to me is that why we're having this equity talk, and that why we, you know, with the questions that we have about where we're going next in this. You said something when Tanya and I called you to set up this event, where you said, you know, the one thing that concerns me is that we move so quickly as a society, and I'm sure social and media, that doesn't help either. Is that when I called you a month or so ago, thank goodness, and you said you were interested, you said, well, things were way different then. George Floyd had just happened. You have been, and back then were on podcasts and panels. Like you said, now some organizations who are never interested now want to connect with you. And that was so important for our conversation today on where we go next, because I think even in the 3 or 4 weeks that we haven't talked, now we're kind of gone to the election. And so it's kind of like we've switched from thing to thing to thing. And I know that a lot of the questions, and I also want to encourage people too, if you have questions that I can ask Danielle along with a few others, on where do we go next and what are kind of some of those tangible things. And I wanted to hear, you know, from you in your leadership role with the NAACP. When you talk about those donations, can you talk a little bit about, I think on our end, we saw that too. I'm proud that NRP did, you know, we put out a statement, you know, pretty quickly, so it wasn't reactive to everyone else doing it. We were one of the first companies, and that's, you know, thanks to our leadership who has been doing this before all of this has happened. But can you tell us where does that, you know, because when we think of what we want to do, we think donate, get involved in an organization. You know, can you tell us about the best ways to support?
yeah.
Do those dollars help? Is our time better?
Yeah, so I think it's a combination of multiple things, you know. So the statements are important because there are some people that's where they're going to engage. Is they're learning by reading, they're learning by seeing who is supportive. And in our society, endorsements are one of the ways that we think about saying yes or no to something. So there's somebody who respects the leadership of NRP, and when they see NRP put out a statement, that means, okay, there must be something here. So I think using our platforms and our voices is one way that we can contribute, because like I said in the slides, the next generation is watching, but our peers are watching as well. There are other people who are watching. Giving resources, absolutely. You know, the systemic racism and injustice and racial discrimination is a very costly thing to our society. And so we cannot solve it simply just by volunteerism. And that's sometimes something that people struggle with, is there is a certain element of this that is charitable work, for sure. But there's also some element of this that has to be looked at from a business imperative as well. So long as we have the desperate, you know, ranges of income and poverty within our society, it makes it more challenging for us as a society to continue to move forward together. We just continue to see in certain places where the gap in wealth and income is widening. So then that means there's this have and have not situation, and someone has to grapple with how do we take care of the have nots. And so I think that a part of the body of work that people can support when they're providing resources to organizations like the NAACP and others is we are working at the policy level to try and help communities and institutions grapple with their role in this, and to come up with policies that create more sustainable systems for us, because we cannot solve this just by charitable donations. But then showing up in places, showing up as an ally, showing up as a member is also very important. I'll give a very specific example. During the height of the civil unrest, I had a white male that reached out to the branch and said, listen, I don't necessarily know what I can do. My background's in tech, and I know how to do website design and stuff. And if there's anything you guys ever need, let me know. So if you go visit our website now, I wish I had a screenshot. I could have put that in the slide of what it used to look like and what it looks like today. that was allyship, and that was him showing up and didn't charge us anything and has overhauled our whole website. And so that is a way that people have used their talent and resources to be able to contribute to the movement. And he's not looking for, you know, praise and accolades. It was just something that he knew he could bring to the table. And so, and I think, as I said this to you all as well when we were preparing for this, many people are looking for somebody else to do it. But it really is each of us showing up again in the spaces that we're in. So when's the last time you have had a conversation with a neighbor in your community that looks different than you? When's the last time, if you're a parent in school, you've had a conversation with another parent that looks different than you? Or in work, or wherever you show up? How can you be a better advocate? How can you be a better ally? And as a person of color, when's the last time you've seen somebody else, you know, mistreating somebody, and maybe it wasn't directed at you, but did you show up for your peer and say, you know what, yes, that was wrong, and I witnessed it, and I'll be willing to go on record saying I saw what happened. And that's scary. And I tell people all the time that people believe that folks like me just have this like built-in, you know, courage. And courage is not the absence of fear, it's acting in spite of it. So even in the face of fear, still doing the things. Because when I go in the room, it's uncomfortable being the only Black person. It's uncomfortable sometimes being the only woman, but I still have an obligation, because if I have the privilege to have a seat at that table, I have to use my voice. And I can't, and it literally, like, I can't rest. If I walk out of a meeting and there was something that was burning inside of me that I should have said and I didn't say it, I will be disturbed all the rest of the day. So I try and do it in a very, you know, productive way, because that's really important, that we don't shut people down and we don't give them space to be vulnerable, to ask the things that they don't know or to have those experiences. But I try and make sure I let my voice be heard and I say the things that I feel are necessary to move us forward, not to just be critical, but to come with solutions and ideas as well.
Yeah, that's important. And I wanted to talk a little bit too, just to give us an idea with the work you do. We're a national company, but you're in Cleveland, obviously, and working deeply in Cleveland. Can you tell us, like, what for you in this time, especially with so much going on, what are some of your priorities, you know, from the organization standpoint locally, but then do those connect to the national ones? Can you give us a little insight on that, and maybe even, you know, areas where you need support locally or nationally?
Yeah. So the local efforts and the national efforts generally are very aligned, just the way that our structure is set up. But locally, we're focusing a lot on the census right now. We're focusing on educating people about how they register and participate in voting in November. We are a nonpartisan organization, so we're not endorsing any candidates, but we really want people to be educated, and we really want to get people more civically engaged. You know, there's a lot of bodies of research that indicate the more people feel ownership of their communities, the more they protect them. They make sure that, you know, the services that are necessary are provided. And so when people don't engage in the political process and a democracy, that oftentimes indicates that they don't really feel that ownership and connection to their community, and they're willing to let other folks make decisions for them. And so really one of the roles that we think is important is helping people to understand the importance of every single election, help people better understand who's in charge of making, you know, what types of decisions. The census is obviously very important when we think about all of the resources that are attached to people completing the census. And we also know that there's been a lot of misinformation that's gone out into communities about what happens if you complete the census, and, you know, the government's going to get your information. If you have a warrant, you're going to get arrested. And so we're also trying to kill the myth about the census. And then broadly, again, we're always looking at policy and legislation. So things that are happening at a state and local level, we don't get involved really in federal. We have a Washington Bureau with the National Association that does that. But really trying to look at, you know, again, when I say like voting, can we get it so that way every voter could get a vote by mail application mailed to them with postage paid? So we're advocating for things that will make it easier for people to access the polls. And then we do a lot of community engagement, again, to make sure people understand and have connections to resources. Because like I said, the NAACP is all led by volunteers. We currently have a staff person and we'll be bringing on a few more people because people do call us for complaints often. And what we spend a lot of time doing is helping them learn how to navigate the systems that are already in place. You know, you have housing programs, you have financial resources sometimes that are available for disadvantaged people. And sometimes we just don't know how to gain access to them. So we are also a resource to the community where when someone is in need of something, even if we can't provide that service directly, we're able to help navigate them to the best solution. And finally, I would say another one of our local focuses is really youth. We know that there are so many, I think even right now during the pandemic, so many issues with young people who were used to, at minimum, the structure of going to school, the structure of being out of the house for a certain amount of hours a day. And so we're really grappling with how do we ensure that we don't have continued widening of disparities as students are learning from home. You have families where you have multiple children, different ages, who all need to be on devices at the same time. And maybe they don't have the space where a house is big enough to spread out and everybody can go in their own room to have their quiet time for education. And so really talking to educators and talking to elected officials and philanthropy about what we do to make sure we're being very thoughtful about how we educate our kids and don't have a widening of, you know, even the education gap in this moment. And so volunteers are showing up again in different ways as we're doing things around voting and the census. We've done recently an effort with an organization that was locally founded from a couple of groups called Mask for the Community, where we've been building kits where people can provide masks with information about navigating COVID-19, especially as we're under this statewide mandate for people to wear masks. We know that some people don't have access to buy the disposable masks. So we wanted to provide a reusable mask to as many people as we could so they can at least rewash it and have, you know, access to something like that.
And you talk too a lot about your relationships, like being influenced and understanding how important relationships are. And now that's kind of led to work with your company and kind of being the middle person and helping people win on both sides and having those partnerships. And I want to touch on something when you said how many people now and companies have realized, okay, this has got to be our priority. I wanted to hear a little bit more about how you would advise going about some of those partnerships or going about connecting with groups in the work we do, whether that's personal relationships or whether that's, you know, professionally through groups. What are some of those tips that you would give in terms of connecting, reaching out, and learning more to create meaningful partnerships?
Yeah. So one of the first things I think about is like, can you start with people or programs that you already have some sort of connectivity to, right? And I give this analogy because I think I'm a very visual person sometimes, and it helps to really reinforce what I'm hearing in words. You know, when you're trying to plant a seed in the ground, it's easiest to do it if you're closer to the dirt, right? So if I need to get that seed in there, if I'm 100 yards away trying to break, it's going to be a very hard thing. So there's one thing for me to go out and provide people with lots of different organizations that they should think about. But one of the best things to do is do an inventory of who's already in your network and where they're showing up in spaces. What organizations are they involved in that you could learn from them? So a lot of people that I know, when they first were trying to figure out what to do, they did reach out to me because they know I'm connected with NAACP. So they said, well, hey, tell me a little bit more about what you do and how might I, you know, participate and show up. Also, I have friends that serve on other nonprofit boards that are working with, you know, marginalized or disadvantaged communities. And they've had the same sort of experience where people have reached out to them to understand more about the body of work that they're involved in and doing. So I think a first great step is to just do a little bit of an inventory of who's already in your network and where they're serving, because then instead of just like going out and Googling a bunch of organizations, you can talk to someone that has some sort of experience with an organization that you might think that you want to either serve with or donate to or learn more about. So that's a first step. I think that the next thing that I would recommend that people do is just know that even when you start to navigate those experiences, you may also have to be a little bit uncomfortable, right? Because like the NAACP, while we were founded actually mostly by white people, a lot of white people think that they can't be a member, and that's not true, right? So it's even knowing that when you show up in some of these organizations, you might have a bunch of people that don't look like you that are the ones that are in charge, that are running it, but really it is an opportunity to be on the other side of what it feels like to be the minority in the room. And sometimes that's an uncomfortable feeling. And if it's the first time someone is feeling that experience, there is value in not just throwing yourself to the wolves, so to speak, and showing up somewhere and nobody knows you. But again, identifying some folks that you know that can safely, say safely just from the sense of like it can be an uncomfortable thing, bring you to a space in the room, you know, even if it's in virtual now, since we're not doing a lot of stuff together, that creates that awareness, that it creates that proximity. So that way, as you begin to want to navigate those spaces on your own, to my point about relationships, you've already started to build relationships with some people. So that way, again, people are not curious about like, why is this person showing up here and nobody knows who they are? Because that's also an uncomfortable thing, I think, on both sides. Most people just in life, there's a little bit of unease with the unknown. That's just partly human nature, you know?
Absolutely. And I asked that question, and we had a question come in, so I wanted to read it from Jonathan. It came through in the chat, and he wants to thank you for being here with us, and says one of the things you mentioned was about whether we white people are reaching out to neighbors that look different than us. How do you recommend connecting with friends, colleagues, and associates of color in a moment without creating emotional labor for them that actually needs to be done by non-people of color? And I think that's a great question. And I think especially in the heat of all the George Floyd and the protests, I think a lot of people felt that. Can you speak to that? I think it's a good question of like how to approach someone when you want to have that conversation. And I think we talked about like not wanting to say the wrong thing. So yeah, you have any insight on that?
Yeah. So the first thing I would just ask everybody to think about is like, none of us, Black people, white people, whoever, you know, yellow, brown, red, are taught how to have these conversations. There's not like I went to school and someone prepped me for having conversations about racism, discrimination, whatever. You kind of just end up in these spaces where it begins to happen. And so some people become more equipped than others. And so I always tell people to have a level of patience, because not every, you know, person of color or non-person of color is coming from the same vantage point and is necessarily emotionally or so the emotional intelligence to handle the difficulty of navigating these kind of conversations. And so again, that same conversation about proximity, it is sometimes challenging for some people versus others. I know that I had some people I met in college that said college was the first time that they had really, really met a Black person, right? And so that might mean that as you look at your network, it becomes harder and harder to say, do I have any people who are not white in my immediate network that I can go to, and not necessarily ask or expect them to tell me like how they're feeling? Because that was one of the things that was a little bit burdensome at the beginning, was like, how are you feeling? I'm like, well, to be honest with you, I've been feeling this way, right? Like the George Floyd thing didn't elicit a new frustration. I had already been frustrated. But it was eye-opening to me that there was something about that moment for a lot of people, especially non-Black people, that was different for them. And so I started to evaluate like what could have made them feel different. And I say that I think some of it was like the narrative that's often associated with you know, violence against Black men, I will say specifically in police encounters, is I feared for my life. They weren't, you know, they were resisting. I thought they had a weapon. But I think many people saw George Floyd in a prone position, hands behind his back, in handcuffs. And for almost 9 minutes to see someone have their hands in their pocket and the facial expression that just seemed like there was no value to his life, I think that made people feel very different in that moment. And so what I have had to kind of grapple with as I'm having conversations is for people to understand that many Black people have been feeling this way for a very long time. So there was not some specifically new feeling. But to answer the question more specifically about how to do it, I always say take an inventory of who's in your immediate network first. And if you don't have a very diverse network to begin with, talk to your friends and see if some of them do, because everybody's life experiences are different. And maybe someone grew up in a place that was much more diverse, so they already have that, or they live in a neighborhood or community that already is. And then I think it's partly being willing to have that rejection of like reaching out and then people not wanting to reach back. And that sometimes is why we stay kind of in our various corners. It's like, well, I reached out and I got my hand slapped, so enough of that, I'm not doing it anymore. But be willing to know that it's a journey, right? It's a marathon, it's not a sprint. And so that first attempt at trying to talk to your neighbor, and I know my sons and I experienced it, we've gotten more waves in our community than we ever have. And so that's a first, right? People are making eye contact now instead of looking away. So we wave back. And that will then create a space where we might be in the driveway at the same time, and now we're having a conversation across the cars, right? So it doesn't have to be a, all in one fell swoop, like, I need to know your life story, you need to know mine. Let's just start by recognizing each other's presence and not in a threatening way. And then that leads to like, okay, well, this person has expressed some interest in me. So now I'm more comfortable to speak back to John because I've seen him, in the community, but we've never actually had a conversation. So I think it's baby steps, take the small steps, just like if you were trying to court somebody, right? You don't do it all in one day. Like, who is this guy? He met me, now he wants to marry me.
Right.
Like, just say hi, start there.
Right.
This is Deborah Guerrero. I have a question. As a Black woman, you said that many times you're the only one in the room. I've experienced the same thing as a Latina, and so I want to hear kind of your experiences and from that perspective, and then also raising sons. I mean, I go back to Congresswoman Ocasio AOC Cortez's statement this last week about just in terms of the treatment of women in of this particular instance, and this is a congresswoman. We talk about George Floyd, but Breonna Taylor, now Oprah is putting her on the cover of the magazine to really elevate that particular incident that happened, that isn't necessarily resulting in the same focus as George Floyd, because those police officers are still out there and not in any way being held accountable for their actions. So as a woman of color in these very sort of places of influence and in the work that you do, can you talk a little bit about your approach in that regard and from that perspective?
Yeah. So, I think that being a mother of two sons allows me to have to be advocating in a dual way, so I do always try and show up for women, but I also show up for men. And I think that there is sometimes this unfortunate like competition between struggle, right? And it's like, is it worse to be LGBTQ or to be Latinx or to be Black or whatever? Marginalized is marginalized. And yes, there are definitely inflection points when our experiences in one category, or especially with intersectionality, someone who is attached to multiple categories will have an outsized struggle in a moment. But there are some spaces where me being a woman has actually been a privilege, because as a Black woman, sometimes I'm viewed as less threatening than a Black man. And I know that as I've navigated in corporate America, I've had Black men who were just as thoughtful and just as articulate and just as smart, who have not always been able to ascend into the same rooms, because at least when people look at me, they can still say, well, she's a woman and I can have a little bit more dominance over her. And so I take that always into the spaces that I go into from a place of advocacy. But to your specific point about how we see the attention show up, unfortunately, sometimes more for, I think, brutality against men versus women, is we automatically, I think, expect the victim to be a man in many of these cases, because most of us would say, well, why would someone do that to a woman? And so I think that the reactions towards what we continue to see against men is almost like, isn't enough already? And there's a certain level of like, I'm exacerbated. And so that's why I'm reacting and sharing my frustration vocally. The other thing, unfortunately, and we have, local cases that we're still advocating for, is there's no video in the case of Breonna Taylor. And it's really frustrating to me that we've gotten to this place where if I'm willing or I have the evidence to put my most vulnerable or frustrating moments of my life on display for you, then everybody will react and want to support it. But if I don't have the video evidence to show you how much pain and suffering I experience, then it's not going to get the same news cycle. And so then it doesn't become as valuable and as important. And so that's something that we struggle with in the world of activism, because I don't watch the videos. I haven't seen a video since gosh, I can't think of his name now. In Manfred, Philando Castile. I accidentally watched that happen on Facebook Live the night that it was going on. And I don't know how. I connected with somebody who also was connected with somebody, and was literally reading the Facebook Live thread with his girlfriend, and people are asking like, where are you? Like, are you okay? You see this white t-shirt with blood on it. And I'm like, what did I just watch? And so I finally go to sleep the next morning. I see all the reports coming out of Minneapolis. I'm like, oh my God, like I was watching that. And so that left such a, like, I don't know, a feeling that I can't shake, that I haven't watched the video since then. But unfortunately, when there is no video, then it becomes like, it's not as salacious. And so as society, we have to work through that and be able to say, someone should not only be ensured the potential for justice because they're willing to turn their life into a video for us. We have to be able to hold our systems accountable for advocating and having justice in spite of, because there is enough evidence in the case of Breonna Taylor to say the system failed her. The system set up a rule that allowed somebody to kick in a door, to shoot a weapon, without any kind of evidence that the person that they were even walking into the home of was the person that they were looking for, right? And so there are so many things, and what we have to be able to do on the other side of that, and when we talk about advocacy, is say, how do we change the system that allows that thing to happen in the first place?
Good question. A couple more questions came in too for you, Danielle. We have one, do you think that we have entered a new phase of movement on racial equity? Because we mentioned we have a short attention span as a culture. So do you think we've entered a new phase of movement on equity? Do you think that society will lose intensity?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I was watching, I don't know if you all have seen, yesterday there was Morgan Freeman read John Lewis's last words for MSNBC's Last Word, and it was an essay that was also published in the New York Times. It was intended to be published after John Lewis passed, as he knew he was dealing with stage 4 cancer and death was imminent. But a part of his remarks, he talked about how Emmett Till was his Rayshard Brooks, and Emmett Till was his Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd. And what I have been grappling with is that every generation has its inflection point. If you go back and look at what birthed movements in society, not just in the United States, but across the world, many times it is tragic, events. You've had the Arab, summer, you had the uprisings, you've had things in Hong Kong, other places. And I do believe that George Floyd and the combination of other things that happen at the same time, we are also experiencing this during a pandemic. We're also experiencing this during a moment where you see something like Ahmaud Arbery, and then out of New York, where the woman called and said, I'm calling, and this African-American man is threatening my life. So that was all within a couple of days of each other. We're getting all of this kind of coming at us in the news cycle. And so I think that we are in an inflection point. I do believe that the generation coming behind many of us who are on this call are very committed to this. So that's why I do believe that we'll see sustained intensity about it, because people like John Lewis were inspired by people like King, who were older than him. And so I think the generation that's watching, they're not going to forget this moment. This is going to be something that propels them and helps them decide what they decide to do with their life. Will they be advocates? Will they, be involved in creating change? Or will they decide to enter into professions that uphold these systems? And so I do believe, just from that personal perspective, that because we've got so many young people watching and so many young people leading the movement, that we're turning a corner.
Absolutely. And I think that was the part that was most inspiring worse, like some of the young people, I think even in like Cleveland Heights and Beechwood, doing these protests with hundreds of people coming out in high school. So I thought that was one of the most inspiring points of all of that happening. I want to read another good question too that came through. How would you define a successful community engagement program from a company like NRP? I think this is good because we talked about connecting professions, and Danielle, you're really involved. So what are some of your thoughts on how we can have successful community engagement?
Yeah. So one of the things that I would always tell people when they're thinking about community engagement is to involve the community in the strategy. As I talked about in terms of why I'm really trying to do what I'm doing from a work and consulting standpoint is we do spend a lot of time planning for other people as opposed to planning with and alongside people. So I would encourage NRP to think about if there is a desire to do community engagement. If you do pick a particular place, right, you know, you guys have properties all over. So you have some natural built-in communities just from the fact of where your residents live. And so how do you use residents that are in your buildings to think about strategies? What is it that they would want to see from you all as someone who built the place that they're living in or manages the property that they're staying in? That's a built-in natural community. So we don't necessarily have to go out and find other people and places. And that's a part of what I think has caused us to be so disconnected in this work, is that people helicopter into a place that they don't ever intend on spending any real time in and coming back to do a 1 or 2 day activity, and then the people never see them again. But how different is it when it's like, no, this is a building that we own, that we plan on coming back to all the time, and how do we just build engagement strategies around the folks that we have some sort of natural alliance to, and vice versa, because then it becomes partnership. And it's not just charity work where I dropped a box off and you'll never hear from me or see me again. And so I think really, really good community engagement leads to partnership, and it leads to long-term sustained engagement, because that's what community needs. We have so many one-time programs that it's a drop in the bucket, and then people enjoyed it, but then it never happens again. And so plan with and alongside the community would be my advice.
Good points. Good points. I know David wanted to have a few words too, if he's up.
Thank you.
David? Okay, yeah.
And Danielle, thank you so much. It's part of the conversation. I was driving, and so my camera wasn't on, but I'm so glad now at the end. But I heard the whole thing, and you are just so impressive, and I can't thank you enough for taking us along on this journey, continuing along. And I want to thank Tanya and Shanice, who have done an incredible job of putting this together today, and the leadership that you've shown. It's just absolutely incredible. And for me, it's really the journey that I'm trying to continue. And you mentioned that, Danielle, about keeping the momentum, keeping this alive, making sure that these conversations continue. To me, that's what's really critically important, is that we do that and we go from statements to action. And I think you've done a really nice job today of showing how we can do that, and how, you just opened my mind to something that has really been a blind spot for me, and that is the engagement of our communities. Because not that we haven't thought about that, but to me, I'm trying to take our entire 850 people on this journey right now within the company. And to me, that's important to do. But then the next step is, how do we take the 20,000 units that we have and take them on the journey? And so, as you mentioned, it starts from that one touch point of that boy with the megaphone to, having that mouthpiece throughout throughout our company, and then throughout our culture, and then beyond, of how we can really make a difference in society. So I can't thank you enough, and thanks to everyone that's on the call today. And I just hope we continue these dialogues. And after hearing you, Danielle, I want to find other avenues to bring you out in the community. I share a position in the community as the board chair of the Jewish Federation, and I'd love to have you come to the Jewish Federation and speak about the work that you're doing, because it's just really impressive. So, and we're taking the 21-day challenge right now. We started on the 27th last Monday through the Jewish Federation of Cleveland, and bringing the Jewish community with YWCA as our partner on that, to go through racial equity and inclusion training and thoughtfulness. So thank you so much for everything.
Thank you. You know, David, I wanted to just say one thing, because I looked at it, kind of how the organization came together, and I told Shanice and Tanya that I feel like as a leader and a speaker, you don't do any value to a group if you just kind of have your prescribed message without being thoughtful about, you know, the institution. And just thinking about, when I talk about access, your story of, hey, you know, as a family friend who was the president of a bank, that's a very powerful connection when you talk about relationships. And as we look at, as we move through this, being able to say, how do we take internal stock for the access that we have and how we leverage that? Because again, many times people are looking for this like real big thing that they have to do. And it's sometimes as simple as somebody's going to respond to an email from you before they do me. And if I'm trying to meet a person and you're like, sure, I know that person, I kind of trust you, I'd be willing to make an introduction, that takes 15 years off of building relationships. And so I just, you know, encourage all of us to think about how we use the access that we have for folks that are trying to get there too.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, I know we're going to wrap it up if there aren't any more questions, but I want to thank everybody for coming to. Danielle, you were wonderful. Thank you for sharing your story. Yes, your insight. And thanks for everyone who came. This is a journey for all of us. We are all evolving as a society. I'm learning, everyone's learning. So I just want to thank everybody for taking their time to listen. Okay, and we'll have another one. We're planning more, so keep coming.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Thank you all so much.